welcome to another episode of On the Middle East. My name is Amber Zaman, and today's conversation will focus on the latest developments surrounding the Kurdish movement in Turkey and Syria, led by the imprisoned Kurdish rebel chief, Abdullah Ocalan. More than a year has passed since Ankara launched a fresh round of what it calls terror-free Turkey talks. The label is meant to appease Turkish nationalist sentiments. However, nothing concrete has come of the talks so far in terms of addressing the Kurds' long-running fight for political rights. The Kurds are doing all the work. Öcalan's Kurdistan Workers Party has agreed to end its 40-year-plus armed struggle against the Turkish state and to disarm. In Syria, a group loyal to Öcalan has agreed to integrate with the Syrian state, ending more than 14 years of effective independence in northeast Syria. Many Kurds are furious. With us here to discuss these developments is Aliza Marcus, the author of Blood and Belief, the most authoritative account of the PKK in the English language. She's just published a sequel called Resurgence and Revolution that provides an exhaustive account of the evolution of the PKK and the Kurdish movement since Öcalan's capture in 1999. Welcome to our program, Aliza.
Thank you, Amber, and it's great to be back.
Yeah, it's been almost a year, I think, and so much has happened between now and then, including the publication of your new book, which is absolutely wonderful, fills so many gaps in our knowledge, and is just so readable. I'm just learning so much. So thank you for doing this incredible work for all of us who are interested in the Kurdish movement. So what struck me, almost immediately as I began reading this book was, in fact, the parallels between what happened to the PKK after the capture of Abdullah Öcalan and that great, tumult that ensued with, the movement seeming rudderless, trying to find its way, trying to decide on a new strategy, and of course, all compounded by the fact that their leader was in jail. And right now, I almost feel that something similar is in the works, that you have this peace process in Turkey, which is so vague and ill-defined. And again, the PKK seems kind of lost. What do you say to that, Aliza? Where is the PKK, even though at the end of your book you do stress that any solution to the Kurdish problem in Turkey needs to take the PKK and its history and its supporters into account?
Yeah, no, that's first of all, thank you for the kind words of praise coming from you, such an expert in this area, and given all the reporting you've done, that really means a lot to me. When you're bringing up this parallel, it's interesting because I actually hadn't thought about that very much. But now that you raise it, it is really a very similar period in a way for the PKK. So after Öcalan's capture, the group really went through this period of internal disarray and questioning and trying to identify what its goals were and what its methods would be, because Öcalan had called off the guerrilla war, he called a ceasefire, and he had gone through this period of coming up with different names and different approaches. And as one person says in my book, like, we were so mixed up, like we just didn't know. From day to day, everything was changing. And that's true. Right now, we have a very similar situation, which is, last year Öcalan called off the guerrilla war. The group promised to disarm and disband, although they haven't disbanded, and they actually haven't disarmed because they're waiting for, they say they're waiting for steps from Turkey, but they're not fighting and they're not doing anything. And at the same time, Öcalan is coming up with new ideas, is that he still talks about some sort of democracy, but he talks about also, he makes references to Kurdish autonomy. He's, what the message is coming from him in terms of what he wants from the Kurds are not clear. And so inside the PKK, there's also this great disarray because what do they do? And without the guerrilla war, and this is something that I think is really, I hadn't realized it until I started researching the book. Without the guerrilla war, the group really doesn't, it doesn't know what to do. And it's hard to hold internal cohesion when you don't have a real focus. And that's what we saw after 2000. And I'm sure that's what's happening right now.
Absolutely. And as you describe in the book in such great detail, I mean, it's incredible, all those party congresses that you chart. Um, Even Öcalan agrees that at a certain point, the war needs to resume. And it just seems to me that given all the setbacks they've faced, and we do really need to talk about what happened in Syria, are they in a position to really fight again? I mean, the nature of the war has changed so much because the technology has been revolutionized. And in the meantime, you've had massive changes in the region, the fall of the Assad regime, Iran badly weakened, and the Kurds in Iraq also, again, at each other's throats. So what do you foresee in the you know, in the immediate term for this movement and for Öcalan?
Right. So I think that, this question of what can the PKK do? Can it go back to fighting? Because that's always been, they've had ceasefires and they've always reverted back to violence when things look like they're not moving ahead. But in this case, there is a huge difference. And the difference is that by the time Öcalan called off the guerrilla war, the war had essentially ended. There was no fighting in Turkey as such. Anything that was happening inside of Iraqi Kurdistan, and it was mainly defensive on the part of the PKK. They were being attacked by drones and aircraft, and they just aren't, they're not set up to defend themselves that way. I mean, they're, at the end of the day, they're still a very lightly armed organization. They don't have, an established military. And increasingly, I think you could ask, what were they actually fighting for? I mean, they were fighting for territory, to hold territory in Iraqi Kurdistan, which is not the territory they were initially fighting for anyway. They were basically just fighting, it seemed, for their survival. I think that ending the war was really the right choice of the PKK. They hadn't really gained anything from it in the past couple of years. Certainly, there was pressure from the Iraqi Kurds to end the war because this has been incredibly destabilizing for them. And the group, I mean, the group's been fighting for decades. So at this point, the fact that they've stopped fighting, I think it would be really hard for them to restart. I just think there's a lot of pressure on them not to restart locally. Obviously, anything they do against Turkey can still have repercussions against Kurds in Syria. But one thing has changed, though. You have now the conflict in Iran, and you have the PKK's PJAK arm is obviously one of the leading Kurdish groups that are armed and in theory, as we know from the discussions over the past few months, could be involved if there were any ground assault in Iran. So that does give the PKK, at the same time, while they've called off other things, it does give them one outlet for focusing people and attention on an armed conflict. But overall, no, I don't see them as being able to restart, as being able to, or even wanting to restart the fight against Turkey.
Well, their one crowning achievement for a long time seemed to be Rojava and the statelet that they created there and the impact they had on world public opinion through their courage in the face of ISIS and this extraordinary partnership they forged with the United States, which elevated them to a level of legitimacy unseen, unprecedented, and which, of course, crashed the relationship between Turkey and the United States. But now what we see is kind of, at least to many people, ashes. And so, as you said, how does this organization, first of all, justify what happened there? Because there's so much anger. Or was it really beyond their control? And is the PKK side finally on the path of true dissolution this time?
So let me start with the last part of your question first, which is on true dissolution. I would say no, they're not on the verge of dissolution. And the reason is because while the armed struggle is what defined them, the fact is over the past 2 decades in particular, the group has built up very strong political institutions, cultural groups, networks of supporters in all different ways. And they still remain the dominant political force, I would say, over Kurdish nationalism inside Turkey and still inside Rojava. So without the guerrilla war, they can continue. They can continue to exert power and influence over Kurdish activities. Um, so there's no question that they're not, even if they dissolve as a military force, they remain as a political force. I think this is very important
And you believe
to
that's
keep
the
in
case
mind.
in Syria as well, where they have
In
signed
Syria,
an
for
integration
yes,
deal with Damascus.
in Syria, still on the ground, I feel they're very influential and important. I feel like in Syria, we're a little bit too early to decide whether what's actually going to, what's happened in the end. Like we know that there's this integration. We know that there were demands for autonomy that weren't met, but we don't really understand yet, or it hasn't been decided, how are things going to work politically there? How are they going to work with the education system? How involved is Damascus going to be in terms of trying to govern Rojava, or will it, cede it as it has so far to Kurdish politicians who themselves had grown up in this movement inside Rojava, a movement that was led by the PKK's affiliates. So I know that there's a lot of anger. I know there's a lot of frustration. But I think we don't really, it's too early to figure out like have they lost everything or did they gain something? And the question is, could they have done things differently? I mean that's been debated a lot. I don't know if you want to, if you have a view on that, I'm sure you do.
Oh, I do have a view on that, and that is they were in a constant state of war, initially with ISIS, but also fighting a second front against Turkey and its Sunni proxies in Syria. And it was just devastating and so much displacement, suffering, attacking critical infrastructure, leaving people without water, power, bakeries were struck. So I think the criticism is truly unfair. It's easy to sit in Europe and wave the Kurdish flag and be indignant about this so-called betrayal. So I totally agree with you, Aliza, and that also we haven't seen the end of this story yet. But can we separate? Because a very interesting chapter in your book deals with how, at one point, the Syrian Kurds inside the PKK decided they wanted to go their own way in Syria, and that was crushed quite ruthlessly by the PKK leadership, and some people were even killed. Do you see a similar moment right now? Do you think the Syrian Kurds are saying to themselves, the PKK Kurds, hey, we've done our part. Now we need to guarantee our future inside Syria. We're Syrians after all. We're going our own way. Or do they continue to hitch their wagon to PKK Central and to Abdullah Öcalan?
So yes, that period that you're talking about when the Syrian Kurds tried to go their own way is that 2004 split inside the PKK when, people like Nizam Etintash and many other leading Osman Öcalan leaders in the PKK split and tried to form another organization. And at that time, those who left included leading figures in PKK affiliate groups like the Iranian group and the Syrian PYD group. And they did try to form their own organization and they were crushed. So the question of what happens to the PYD now and to PKK influence there, in a way, it makes sense to look back when the PYD was formed. When it was formed in 2003, the idea was, at least in theory, was that PYD, PJAK, and a small group for Iraq would operate under the general umbrella of the PKK, but they would be free to really develop and respond and focus their attention as they saw fit, and that they would be led by Syrian Kurds or Iranian Kurds or Iraqi Kurds. As that worked out in practice, of course, it didn't work out that way because, the PKK has always had trouble letting go of things, and it became very much an arm of the PKK, but one very much directed and under the control of the group, or it was part of the group. It wasn't even that it was under the control of the group, it was part of the group. And so that idea of having an independent but loosely affiliated organization just never was realized. in some ways, I think now is possibly the opportunity for that to happen. Because let's face it, it still is the PKK through its affiliates that built everything in Rojava, that organized people, that created these, micro governing institutions, that led the education movement. All that just doesn't disappear very easily. I mean, the people in Syria, the Syrian Kurds who worked on this and pushed it forward, have gained a lot of experience. I mean, they worked on the ground. So maybe now is the time that they actually start to operate as the organization that the PKK first envisioned them, which is really almost an independent organization of that's linked somehow still ideologically loosely to the PKK. So, in other words, I don't think the PKK is lost in Rojava. It still is highly influential through its affiliates, but over time, in a way, that control is just, I mean, even to today, it has to be lessened. I mean, there's just not the same, they don't have the same freedom that they had, a
Maybe
year ago
not.
when it was fully under their control.
Maybe not,
But
but just think about it. Someone like Sipan Hemel, a top PKK commander, is now sitting in Damascus wearing a suit probably, and is one of the deputy defense ministers. That's a big deal, right? People may
that's
say, "Oh, he sold out, he's joined the." No, I think that's pretty significant. Would you agree? For
I mean, I
example,
think,
and this is
yeah, no,
just
I
the
think it's
beginning.
significant. I don't necessarily means it doesn't necessarily mean like Murat Karyalan is sitting in Damascus, via Sipan
No,
Hamo, right? But
no.
in terms of, look, I agree with you. I think the decisions that were made by Muslim Kobani and others at the time last year were the only decisions they could take. There was no chance to fight against the Syrian state. And once the sanctions were lifted, Syria was back and part of the international community. So they had to adjust. But yes, having leading PKK figures in the government and in other positions is a sign of, at least right now, certain gains. We have to see how they play their hands going forward.
No, absolutely. But still, the symbolism of it to me is quite striking. I mean, we couldn't picture, as you said, Murat Karayılan as a deputy defense minister in Ankara. I mean, perhaps
Right.
the wrong parallel given the weight of Karayılan, but still, it's pretty. I thought it was quite amazing. I certainly wasn't expecting it. And let's see what Shara does. He's a very smooth operator. He needs
Right.
the Kurds to consolidate his grip and to legitimize his rule, especially in the face of, the opposition he faces from the Druze, for example. So going forward, the big challenge facing the movement, as you said yourself, is how do they sustain the interest in the group? How do they continue to recruit people to the movement when they don't seem to have a very well-defined ideology anymore? Actually, somebody both you and I have met and whose name we should best what not mention suggested that the whole Apo ideology had collapsed, and today in Syria at least, the SDF is looking more like the other Sunni factions who are now negotiating power with the central government. I pushed back against that idea because they are connected to a global Kurdish movement, which is much bigger than Rojava. But my concern would be also over time, does the shape of the relationship with Damascus cease to be about principles and Kurdish rights and more about negotiating contracts and my share of it? That sort of thing. We saw what happened in Iraqi Kurdistan, the corruption, mind-boggling. And everyone there used to point to the PKK and say, these guys don't sit in gold chairs. Is that something that you think is possibly a threat down the road?
I think anytime you're mixed in with the state, there's always the threat of corruption. And the group is, but the group, as you said, has always been looked at by other Kurds as not being corrupt, as really being focused. We'll see how they evolve there. I mean, this is really the first time that they're playing a very legitimate role in a government. Um, And they don't have a lot of experience in that, so we don't really know how
Well,
that's going to affect them.
it's still a pretty big deal, Muslims speaking to Macron on the phone and stuff like that. I mean,
No, for sure. I mean, look, for sure, they've definitely, I don't like you, I don't agree with people who say they've lost everything. They
no,
made huge mistakes. They should have done X or
you
Y.
and
No,
I
I think
know because we were in
we were
Southeast
there.
Turkey in the 90s. We saw what happened. So we can, put
Also, yeah, also look, the reality of the situation was if they had chosen to stand against the negotiations with Shara at that point, there was a danger of a full out fight. And not just one from Shara, but potentially from Turkey, putting pressure on them from the north. They couldn't defend the territory, and they didn't have the international support. And I don't agree with critics who say, well, they could have played the international community differently at that point. There were a lot of things bigger than Rojava going on at
I
that
completely
moment.
agree with you. And Turkey is a NATO country. And look at the map, and that kind of tells you everything.
Yeah,
Location, location, location. Look at Iran with the Hormuz Strait. I mean, Turkey, you know, wins hands
yeah.
down in terms of strategic significance in the broader scheme of things. The Kurds, have a far less significant role.
It was a very difficult time. And I think they took the only decisions they could. Sure, on the edges, maybe something here or there could have been different, but I mean, generally speaking, this was the deal they were offered, and this was the only deal they were going to get.
Yeah,
So the question is, what do they do with it now?
right.
And how do they? And I think they're standing up, they're making demands. I mean, neither of us, I think, have been back since then,
No,
since the
not since
changeover. So,
January. I haven't been
right.
back. And they're very hard
So,
to get a hold of, by the way. They're being really quiet, staying under the radar, not talking to journalists much anymore. So it's a lot of work trying to get any
but
information. So I'm sure
but
you're,
Syria's changed completely. Assad is gone. The Kurds are recognized now as part of Syria. Whether they're getting their demands fully realized or not, their demands are on the table. Somebody is listening to them, somebody is talking to them. I mean, these are big changes for Kurds in Syria. And it goes back to really what the PKK and its affiliates did there in Rojava. Without that fight, we wouldn't even be, the Kurds wouldn't, I don't think they'd even be at this point right now.
no, I completely agree. And there's now, of course, the big issue of what happens to the women fighters. So
Hmm.
we'll have to see how that pans out. But it also needs to be understood that Shara, okay, sure, he was a jihadi, may he still is one, but he also has constituents that he needs to
Hmm.
satisfy. And you can't just import a whole bunch of radical feminists and have them, live shoulder to shoulder with guys who, are quite different in their worldview. So these things will take a lot of time. But going back to where this all started, Turkey, that's where everything to me seems far less clear in many ways because
Right.
Erdogan hasn't really shown his hand. We have this very bizarre phenomenon of Devlet Bahçeli, the nationalist leader who used to bay for Öcalan's blood, now elevating him. And just today, I believe, said, he needs to be given some kind of title, some
Yes,
status. So this is also quite extraordinary, right? I mean, okay, so far nothing concrete is on the table, but they're still talking the talk, even if they're not walking the walk, right?
absolutely. No, and I think that you know, the fact that there is, as imperfect as these peace negotiations are, and the lack of clarity, the fact is there is an end to fighting, which is positive for both sides. And there is some discussion going on. Somehow people are talking ideas, like you said, Devlet Bocelli made this amazing suggestion today, which,
Yeah.
5, 6 years ago, even we would have been shocked to hear it. And now it's like, well, yeah, he's become very liberal in how he wants to approach this peace process. The challenge is that it's not moving very fast. But as I said, I think Turkey has time on its side because it's not easy. I would argue almost impossible for the PKK to start fighting again. Okay, it's not impossible for them to start fighting again, but it's certainly not easy. And
It
so
would be
that
a
threat,
stupid idea, basically.
it would be a bad idea. I just think it would be difficult for them to implement right now. Just because this isn't working, it doesn't mean that the group doesn't have political influence and can't use its political influence and can't push for, continuing expanding of culture, language, some type of autonomy. I mean, it can use the institutions it has on the ground to continue its battle, albeit a nonviolent one.
And we all know that Erdogan needs the Kurds, if we're going to have any semblance of a legitimate election, however much, the playing field is no longer level and that the rules are not fair, votes still count and the Kurds matter. They sway elections. So we'll have to see. Well, Aliza Marcus, thank you so much for joining us here today. And I strongly recommend her book. It's really, really fascinating and fills in so many gaps, as I said. So, yes, thank you, Aliza.
Okay, thank you, Amberin.
Well, this brings us to the end of this week's episode of On the Middle East. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Aliza as much as I did. For more coverage on the Kurds, the Iran conflict, and more, go to our website, www.al-monitor.com. Thank you and goodbye.